Hello and welcome. Today we embark on a journey back to the darkest days of 1944, to the Pacific Ocean, where the steel giants of the American fleet were waging a war of attrition against the Japanese Empire. For many veterans, for many historians, these years are associated with the greatest naval battles in history: Midway, Guadalcanal, the Leyte Gulf. But just when victory seemed within reach, a new, soul-chilling threat emerged from the skies. A threat for which the most powerful navy in the world had no ready answer. This is not a story about battleships or aircraft carriers. This is the story of the workhorses of the fleet, the Cleveland-class cruisers, and of a brilliant, controversial decision born of desperation that changed the rules of the game in the fight against the divine wind, the Kamikaze. Imagine yourself on the deck of the light cruiser USS Denver in the fall of 1944. You are off the coast of the Philippines. The humid, salty air is thick with the smell of cordite and diesel fuel. For months, you have lived under constant tension. A call to battle stations is followed by a short respite, and then battle stations again. But today, something is different. Japanese aircraft, which you've come to regard as a predictable enemy, are behaving differently. The planes no longer try to drop their bombs and escape. They dive directly at you, without hesitation, without any instinct for self-preservation. In the cockpit sits not just a pilot, but a living guided missile. And his sole purpose is to die, taking you and your ship with him. These were the kamikazes. For American sailors, this was not just a new type of weapon. It was a psychological shock. How do you fight an enemy who places no value on his own life, who has turned his own aircraft into his funeral pyre? Initially, the U.S. Navy's anti-aircraft defense system was built on the principle of layered defense, and it was considered the best in the world.
The first line was the fighter screen, patrolling Hellcats and Corsairs that were meant to intercept the enemy dozens of miles from the fleet, guided by ship's radar. The second line, if the enemy broke through, was the long-range anti-aircraft artillery, the legendary 5-inch 38-caliber dual-purpose guns. These guns, mounted in twin turrets, could send shells to an altitude of over 37,000 feet. They were the heart of the AA defense of any major warship. The third line was the medium and close-range anti-aircraft defense. Here, the Swedish Bofors reigned supreme. 40mm automatic cannons mounted in quad and twin mounts. They spat out a hail of explosive shells, creating a wall of steel in the sky. And finally, the last chance, the 20mm Ehrlichens scattered across all decks and superstructures. Their job was simple: to shred anything that made it through the Bofors fire. It seemed like an impenetrable defense, but it was designed to combat conventional targets, torpedo bombers flying low over the water or bombers coming in at high altitude. The Kamikaze broke this system. A Japanese pilot, often in an obsolete but light and maneuverable Zero, could approach at high altitude, staying outside the effective range of the Bofors, and then transition into a steep, almost vertical dive. And this is where the problems began. The brain of the entire AA system was the gunfire control director. On the Cleveland-class cruisers and many other ships, this was the famous Mark 37 gunfire control system. It was a marvel of analog engineering. Imagine a small armored turret located high on the superstructure. Inside, a crew of several men, a radar, and a complex optical rangefinder. Data from the radar and optics, range, speed, target course, was fed through cables down into the heart of the ship, to the main battery plotting room. There, its mechanical brain was located. The Ford Mark I fire control computer. This was a cabinet weighing 1.5 tons, packed with thousands of gears, shafts, discs, and servos. This mechanical computer calculated the lead with astonishing accuracy, the point in space where the barrels of the 5-inch guns needed to be aimed so that the shell would meet the target several seconds later. Electric motors then automatically turned the heavy turrets and elevated the barrels to the correct angle. All the gunners had to do was load the guns and pull the trigger. For its time, it was a genius system. But against the Kamikaze, it failed. The problem was speed. Not just the speed of the plane, but the rate of change of its angular coordinates. When a Kamikaze entered its final dive, it was hurtling toward the ship at immense speed, and its position in the sky was changing in a flash. The cumbersome Mark 37 director simply couldn't keep up. Its drive motors couldn't traverse and elevate fast enough. The Mark I mechanical brain, designed for the smooth trajectories of bombers, began to get overwhelmed by the data stream and couldn't produce an accurate solution. As a result, the 5-inch guns often opened fire too late, or their shells passed harmlessly behind the target. The plane would then break through into the Bofors engagement zone. And here, a second problem arose. Most 40mm mounts were locally controlled. Each mount had its own gunner who aimed by eye through a simple ring sight, trying to guess where the plane would be. In the heat of battle, when the sky around you is filled with the bursts of friendly and enemy shells, when a screaming engine is diving at you, and you realize this man wants to die right where you are standing, maintaining composure and accuracy was nearly impossible. The fire was furious, but often inaccurate. Too many shells missed their mark. The fleet was at an impasse. The most advanced anti-aircraft system in the world was ineffective against the most primitive yet fanatical of tactics. A new approach was needed. And it came not from the high offices in Washington, D.C., but from the men who saw this threat with their own eyes. Deep within the Navy's Bureau of Ordnance, or simply BU-ORD, work was always humming. Engineers and officers were constantly searching for ways to improve the fleet's weaponry. The idea that would ultimately save thousands of lives was in its essence revolutionary, and, as is often the case, initially seemed like heresy. Instead of trying to make the large and complex Mark 37 system even more complex and faster, a group of forward-thinking engineers proposed a different path. They said, let's create a small, simple, and very fast system, specifically for our Bofors. Let's give our 40mm guns their own brain. Thus was born the Mark 51 Fire Control Director. Compared to the behemoth Mark 37, it was tiny. It looked like an armored box on a pedestal, from which protruded a Mark 14 gun sight, which looked similar to those mounted in fighter planes. The operator didn't sit inside. He stood on the deck, controlling the director with 2 hand grips, and looked at the target through this advanced gun sight. Inside the Mark 14 gun sight was a gyroscope. As the operator tracked the target with the sight's reticle, the gyroscope measured the target's angular velocity. Based on this data, a simple mechanical calculator inside the sight instantly computed the necessary lead. All the operator had to do was keep the glowing reticle on the target, and the system did the rest.
It transmitted the data via electrical cables directly to the 40mm mount's drive motors, and the mount automatically trained on the lead computed point. The advantages were enormous. First, speed. The Mark 51 was lightweight and could traverse with incredible quickness, easily tracking even a diving kamikaze. Second, simplicity and accuracy. The operator no longer had to think about lead. His task was simplified to keep the crosshairs on the target. This eliminated a huge portion of human error, especially in a high-stress situation. Third, concentration of fire. A single Mark 51 director could control several Bofors mounts at once. For example, all the guns on one side of the ship. This allowed the fire of dozens of barrels to be concentrated on a single point, creating an impenetrable wall of fire. But here, a problem arose that is familiar to anyone who has dealt with large organizations, especially military ones: bureaucracy. Many admirals and high-ranking officials in BU Ord were against it. Their arguments were, on the surface, compelling. Why do we need another system? We already have the best in the world. This will divert resources from the production of our proven Mark 37 systems. It's too simple to be effective. We're turning our decks into a rat's nest of wires. It was a clash of two philosophies. The old guard believed in large, centralized, all-purpose systems. The new generation of officers who had seen the war in the Pacific understood the need for flexibility, specialization, and rapid reaction time.
1-0 peels off from the group and hurtles toward the Birmingham. It's coming straight for the bow. The Mark 37 director tries to track it, but the pilot executes sharp maneuvers, and the heavy director can't keep up. The 5-inch shells burst behind it. The plane enters the 40mm gun envelope. Previously, each gun crew would have aimed independently, but now the Birmingham is equipped with the new directors. The operator of a Mark 57 director on the forward superstructure acquires the 0 in his gyroscopic gun sight. He simply keeps the glowing reticle centered on the fuselage of the diving plane. He doesn't need to think about lead, wind speed, or the motion of his own ship. He just tracks the target. He squeezes the trigger, and in that same instant, the 4 quad Bofors mounts on the ship's bow, 16 barrels in total, come to life. They don't fire at where the plane is now. Obeying the electrical signals from the director, they fire at the point in space where the plane will be in 1.5 seconds. A stream of tracer rounds, like a fiery laser, lances into the sky. It isn't scattered. It's focused precisely on the lead computed point. The Kamikaze, not expecting such accuracy, literally flies into this wall of steel. The shells tear off its wings and shred its engine. The plane disintegrates in midair, not even getting within 300 yards of the ship. Its burning wreckage plunges into the sea, leaving behind only a cloud of black smoke. There's a brief cheer on deck, but there's no time to relax. Another one is coming in on the other beam. And again, the small, unassuming Mark 57 director does its job. It was in these moments that it became clear. The controversial decision was a brilliant one. The statistics compiled after the Battle of Okinawa were staggering. The 40mm guns under the control of the new directors proved to be roughly 2 to 3 times more effective than those aimed manually. Ships equipped with this system shot down kamikazes far more frequently and at greater ranges, suffering significantly less damage. To this, we must add one more of the war's greatest inventions, which worked in tandem with the new directors: the proximity fuze, or VT fuze. This was a tiny radar set built into the nose of a 5-inch shell. It didn't require a direct hit. The shell would detonate automatically when it passed near target. The combination of precise aiming from the Mark 37 directors and smart shells with proximity fuses for long-range targets, and the Mark 57 directors with the hurricane of fire from the Bofors for close-in targets, finally gave the fleet an effective answer to the kamikaze threat.
The story of the change in fire control directors is not just a story about technology. It's a story of how free thinking and the willingness to abandon dogma can save lives in the face of a new, unimaginable threat. It proves that sometimes the most elegant solution is not the most complex one, but the simplest and fastest. It was a victory of pragmatists over bureaucrats, a victory of the engineers and sailors who faced death every single day. The Cleveland-class cruisers, those tireless workhorses of the war, became the proving ground that validated this heretical approach. By the end of the war, the Mark 51, 57, 63 system had become standard for the entire fleet. It was so successful that modified versions were used in the Korean War and even later, until guided missiles finally replaced gun-based artillery. But for that generation of sailors, for the veterans who stood on the decks off Okinawa and looked up at a sky from which death was diving down on them, these plain-looking boxes with gyroscopic gun sights were not just pieces of equipment. They were a symbol of hope. A symbol that human ingenuity, honed in the crucible of war, could find an answer to any challenge. This was their shield against the divine wind. And that shield held.